Bueno, buenos días, eta eskerrik asko etortzeagatik. En esta mesa hay dignos representantes. Iñaki Gabilondo, ampliamente conocido en Bilbao y en Euskadi, en España, naturalmente. Iñaki Esteban, que no le veo, también ampliamente conocido en Bilbao. Bill Keller es director del New York Times. Estoy muy contento con Nueva York porque hace 3 años en Singapur nos dieron el premio Lee Kuan Yew, que es el premio al urbanismo, el premio más importante que hay de urbanismo internacional, nos dieron a Bilbao. Y 2 años más tarde le han dado a Nueva York. Y para nosotros es importante que la segunda opción del premio haya sido Nueva York. Es un honor y sobre todo, pues, amerita, como dicen los americanos, amerita el premio y nos amerita a nosotros. Paul Hondegraber es ya un hombre conocido en Gutun Suria, lleva muchos años viniendo, es asesor del festival y director del programa LIFE de la Biblioteca Pública de Nueva York. Chuck Palahniuk es un escritor americano y John Verdon es un escritor americano, puesto que este año se dedica, Gutun Suria, a Secretos y Mentiras a Estados Unidos. Quiero recordar que esta casa, este inmueble, que antes era una vieja alhóndiga, alhóndiga viene del árabe, es una palabra árabe, y todavía sigue llamando alhóndiga, no la hemos cambiado, ni la vamos a cambiar. Era un viejo almacén de vinos, un gran viejo almacén de vinos. Cuando yo llegué a la alcaldía me encontré con un viejo almacén de vinos derruido, que más bien era un raterío, estaba lleno de ratas, con unos problemas tremendos en el entorno urbanístico y ciudadano. Y bueno, pues después de 8 años hemos construido esta obra. Afortunadamente no nos ha cogido la crisis, tuvimos años fiscales buenos y pudimos hacer esta obra con una parte deportiva, unas piscinas estupendas, que lo utiliza muchísima gente, y con una mediateca, con unas salas de reuniones, pero sobre todo quiero recalcar una cuestión. En Bilbao siempre hemos tenido un componente cultural muy importante, musical, y un componente de teatro, de revista, de zarzuela, etcétera, ópera, muy importante. Pero nos faltaba otra parte. Nos faltaba el conocimiento de las ciencias físicas, el conocimiento del universo, el conocimiento de la literatura, donde naturalmente había cosas importantes en la Universidad de Deusto, fundamentalmente en la Biblioteca de Bidebarrieta, pero aquí una de las funciones de este edificio era desarrollar, ampliar nuestros conocimientos bilbaínos, por tanto universales, de la literatura. Y Gutun Suria nace así. Gutun Suria nace como una proyección, como una necesidad del conocimiento y de la popularización, si se me permite la palabra, de la literatura. Esta casa ha servido para en pocos años poner en pie todas estas cuestiones y yo estoy encantado con ella. Acabo de sacarme la foto con el número 1.000.000 que ha visitado la mediateca y la verdad es que eso es un orgullo, porque que el ciudadano 1.000.000 haya pasado por la biblioteca es importantísimo. En 2 años de vida que haya pasado 1.000.000 de personas es extraordinario. Que cunda el ejemplo, que sigan, porque este país necesita mucha lectura, mucha reflexión. Aparte de salir de la crisis, necesita, o mejor dicho, para salir de la crisis, necesita mucha reflexión, mucha lectura, mucha literatura y mucha cultura. Muchas gracias. Y ahora creo que Iñaki Esteban, nos va a deleitar con su palabra. Gracias.
Gracias, alcalde. No, simplemente quiero dar las gracias a Chuck, a Bill Keller, por supuesto a Iñaki Gabilondo, y también a John Verdon por acompañarnos, ¿no? Por haber venido a Bilbao. De verdad, muchísimas gracias. Simplemente quiero daros unos datos de lo que vamos hasta ahora de festival, de esta primera parte del festival. En las 5 conferencias que hemos tenido, en los 5 actos que hemos tenido, hay 2.100 espectadores. Ha habido lleno en Almudena Grandes, en Manuel Rivas, ayer también con Daniel Innerarity. Los 2 actos de hoy, Bill Keller con Iñaki Gabilondo, Chuck Palahniuk con Javier Calvo, también están las 400 plazas del auditorio están llenas. Y vamos a habilitar la sala Bastida, que se está mismo de aquí, con una pantalla para que aquellos que no hayan podido entrar al auditorio para que lo puedan seguir en directo. Aparte de, también tenemos el streaming en la página web de la Londia. Y bueno, sin más, quiero dar la palabra a Paul Holdengraber, que os va a presentar un poco a los autores, a la literatura estadounidense, y aunque Iñaki Gabilondo no pertenece a ella, también quería darle unas especiales gracias y bienvenida aquí a la Londia.
Un momento, porque yo tengo que ser también director comercial y tengo que agradecer a los patrocinadores. A la BBK siempre, porque la BBK nos apoya aquí en esta casa de una manera sustancial. Al Correo y a todos los patrocinadores que han estado en la foto conmigo y con nosotros, les agradezco muchísimo y perdonen el lapsus que he tenido. Empiezo a tener ya lapsus, empiezo a ser ya muy mayor. No sé si esto es bueno o es malo. A veces, tal como están las cosas, algún lapsus es interesante, pero todos ya no. Paul.
Sí, muchas gracias. Voy a hablar creo en inglés porque mi español es un poquito folclórico. Pero unas veces voy a hablar también en español. Meya Iñaki Azkuna. The first thing I would like to do, see, I have a lapsus even when I'm younger. The first thing I would like to do is to present you with this book of Salman Rushdie, who came here last year and who inscribed this book for you. So here you are. Salman Rushdie was here last year and wanted you to have this as the mayor of Bilbao. It's a great pleasure and great honor to be here bringing these wonderful writers and thinkers from the United States to Bilbao to create in this city a form of intellectual fervor that is not only dictated by the edifice complex of the Guggenheim Museum, but that there's also something else happening here in this city, in this great library, in this great cultural center. And as you will see from just reading the names of the different talks and conversations you will be experiencing over the next 3 days, you'll see that the themes are far-ranging, and we have created an organized web of obsessions, as it were, around a theme that is quite dear and important and urgent for us, the theme being secrets and lies. La Rochefoucauld, a French writer, once said that if we knew what everybody thought, and if everybody said what they really believed, nobody would be talking to anyone. Another line that I've always very much liked about the notion of secrecy is Thomas Jefferson, who said that for 2 people to keep a secret, one has to be dead. Another line about secrecy that I've always liked is that the secret is something you share with one person at a time. And then finally, my favorite, which I leave for the end, is the very notion of secrecy as a word. A secret, by its very nature, is hard to contain. It secretes. It gives out. It used to be, before what we understand now as secret to be, actually a piece of furniture where you hid secrets, a secretary where there were hidden drawers. And then it became a person who actually works with you. it became your secretary. And if he or she is good, they not only, as in my case, make my life make sense because I live somewhere between chaos and entropy, but also they keep your secrets. They keep what is private confidential. So here today we have journalists and writers, and journalists who are writers, and journalists who are thinkers, and thinkers who are novelists, and novelists who think about secrets and lies and discretion and deception. And they will be addressing issues pertaining to this topic in various ways. A line I'd like to read from John Verdon might serve us as a good entry point. He says, "We all have secrets and none of us is completely truthful." I like that. I'd like you to ponder that. Now, let me just read very quickly to you the subject line of their conversation. John Verdon, who I'll be speaking to tomorrow, his topic is "The Lies We Tell and the Prices We Pay." William Gibson, who will be speaking on Saturday, "Why does it always have to be now? Imagining the future." He will be speaking with Rodrigo Fresan. Bill Keller, who will be speaking this afternoon for us, cultural differences would be this evening, but I know that 7 p.m. is the early afternoon here in Spain. So at 7 p.m. this afternoon or this evening, if we were in New York, he will be speaking. His topic is Deciphering Secrets, and he will be speaking with Inaki Gabilondo, who's right here to my right. Philip Gurevich, who will be arriving tomorrow from Kigali, from Rwanda, where he is now revisiting his book on Rwanda 10 years later, will be addressing issues pertaining to transparency in international politics. I also invite you to read Philip's most recent piece in The New Yorker, I think very important to read this afternoon, on Nicolas Sarkozy in The New Yorker. It's being translated in French as we speak just before the election. It won't have any effect on the election, but it's an interesting piece. I like one thing in particular that Philip Gurevich says about the possible future president is that he doesn't like smelly cheese. And Chuck Palahniuk, his topic is Small Lies as a Means of Discovering a Great Truth, something that might work very well also with John Verdon. Humor as a means of illustrating a tragedy. And he'll be speaking to Javier Calvo. Now, let me read out to you a biography for each one of the writers so you know who we're talking about. John Verdon is a former Manhattan advertising executive whose first novel, Think of a Number, shot to the top of over 20 bestseller lists internationally. More than 200,000 copies of the Spanish translation have been sold under the title Sé lo que estáis pensando. His second novel, Shut Your Eyes Tight, also about a retired New York police detective, was released last year. I'll be interviewing him tomorrow. A new third novel will be released in Spain in June, and I recommend that when it comes time for you to speak, you ask him about it. Chuck Palahniuk is the author of Invisible Monsters, Asphyxia, Nana, Diary, a novel, Haunted, Ran, an oral biography of Buster Casey, Snuff, and Pygmy, among others. His novel Fight Club was made into a highly successful film directed by David Fincher and starring Brad Pitt. In 2008, his novel Choke was made into a film starring Sam Rockwell and Angelica Houston. His interest in his books, he traces his interest is in the written word back to a 5th grade teacher who told him about his writing. Chuck, you do this really well, and this is much better than setting fires, so keep it up. He will be in conversation with Javier Calvo. His last book translated into Spanish is Damned, Condenada. Philip Gurevich is the author of 3 books: Standard Operating Procedure, about torture in Abu Ghraib prison, A Cold Case, and We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families, Stories from Rwanda. And as I said, he's now writing an updated version, if you will, of that book, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Los Angeles Times Book Award, the George Polk Book Award, the Penn Martha Albrand Award, the New York Public Library Helen Bernstein's Award, and in England, the Guardian's First Book Award. His books have been translated into more than a dozen languages. In addition, he has been a regular contributor to the New Yorker since 1995, reporting from Africa, Asia, Europe, and across the United States. He was named in 2005 the editor of the Paris Review, a position he held for 5 years until 2010. He will be in conversation with Inocencio Arias and Rosa Maria Calaf. Though he's probably sick of hearing this, William Gibson popularized the cyberspace in his debut novel Neuromancer, which won 3 major science fiction awards, an unprecedented achievement described by one critic as a sci-fi writer's version of winning the Goncourt, Booker, and Pulitzer Prize all in the same year. Hailed by Stephen Poole of The Guardian in 1999 as probably the most important novelist of the past 2 decades, Gibson is the author of Mona Lisa, Overdrive, The Difference Engine, Virtual Light, Iduru, All Tomorrow's Parties, Pattern Recognition, Spook Country, and this year, Distrust That Particular Flavor, which is his first book of non-fiction. He will be in conversation with Rodrigo Fressan. That last book of non-fiction is very interesting. It's the essays he mainly wrote for Wired magazine. I highly recommend you read it. And finally, Bill Keller. From July 2003 until September 2011, Bill Keller was the executive editor of the New York Times, presiding over the newsrooms through the aftermath of 9/11, the war in Iraq, and the 2008 financial crisis. During his 8 years in that role, the Times won 18 Pulitzer Prizes. Previously, Bill Keller was chief of the Times Bureau in Johannesburg from 1992 until 1995, and a Times correspondent in Moscow from December 1986 to October 1991. His reporting on the easing and ultimate collapse of the communist rule and the breakup of the Soviet Union won a Pulitzer Prize in 1989. He continues to write for the New York Times as an op-ed columnist. He's the author of The Tree Shaker, The Story of Nelson Mandela, published in 2008. This should give you, I believe, a sense of the range of the various guests we have invited, who all in different ways will either stress the importance of lies or the importance of secrecy and ways in which we might discover the truth. Thank you very much.
Bueno, sí, ahora si os parece podéis preguntar lo que queráis a cualquiera de los escritores, a Iñaki, en fin, están todos a vuestra disposición.
Don't be shy.
Sí, hola, yo quería preguntarle al señor Keller si cree que la prensa tradicional ha perdido su papel pues, tradicional de descubrir o desenmascarar las mentiras de los poderes, y ese papel ha sido trasladado a las redes sociales.
Well, it's certainly true that the social network has contributed to the flow of secrets. But I think, just to judge by my own newspaper's work and the English language competitors we deal with, there's quite a bit of secret information that is coming out the old-fashioned way. It's reporters who develop sources, develop relationships with people who know things, develop a level of trust, and in the end report things that maybe institutions and governments would rather we did not publish. I don't think that's declined at all, but I certainly welcome the addition of social media to the party.
En la misma línea, para el señor Keller, va más de un año que el NewYorkTimes.com lanzó la suscripción por pago. Le quería preguntar su valoración sobre cómo ha ido este año y también sobre el futuro de los medios digitales ante esta cuestión de qué debe ofrecer un medio digital para que los lectores estén dispuestos a pagar por lo que leen en Internet. Gracias.
You know, the last year that I was executive editor, I spent a lot of my time at meetings with the people on the business side of the company, trying to figure out whether there was a way to charge readers for access to our journalism online, because it was clear that the revenue from print newspapers is declining, or at least the circulation is declining, and you can raise the price a certain amount, but eventually you run out of room to raise the price. So in the long run, the future survival of the company depended on being able to generate enough money from our digital journalism to pay reporters to go to different places, to take the difficult and sometimes dangerous work take on the work of journalism. When we started that process, I would say people in the newsroom were very much divided, and people in the company were very much divided. There was a strong school of thought that said the internet is free, nobody will pay for anything on the internet. It was almost an ideology that information has to be free. I think in the larger world, that ideology has mostly gone away. People now are accustomed to the fact that you pay for music online, you pay for movies online, you pay for access to television, you pay for subscriptions to magazines online. And that's beginning to be true with newspapers. We are not the first to do it. The Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, for example, have pay models. But ours was certainly watched worldwide, I think, to see whether we could pull it off successfly. We've been charging now for about a year. So far, it seems to be tremendously successful. The number of paid subscribers and the amount of money that we've made from payments online exceeds what we had predicted. And a lot of people who were opposed to the very idea of charging online have actually reversed themselves. Some commentators from the kind of digital world. There's, as you know, there is an enormous chorus of critics, sort of online critics with opinions. Everybody with an internet service provider can be a journalist these days or a commentator. And a lot of the people who were initially skeptical have praised it. And some of them say the reason it works is that it's not a paywall. It's a combination of pay and free. So we have not shut the Times off. We still use it as a reporting tool. We still distribute a tremendous amount of our journalism free. Most of the stuff on the Times you can get free one way or another. But the most convenient way to have it all available is to subscribe to it. And enough people believe in that so far it's been a success. And I think over time that will prove to be our future and probably the future for a lot of other news organizations.
Yo, si me permitís, le preguntaría a Iñaki Gabilondo de cuál es su impresión sobre este cambio también que está experimentando el periodismo, ya que su punto de vista tiene un gran valor y además que le he visto con un iPad esta mañana, o sea que...
Buenos días, bueno, estar con un iPad es una manera de decir que estoy vestido para el mundo en el que vivo. Bueno, yo lo primero que quiero decir es que quiero dar las gracias a la organización que me ha invitado porque me permite hacer cosas que amo, una venir a Bilbao, que me encanta, y otra participar en esta reflexión y al tiempo tener oportunidad de conocer y de preguntar a Bill Keller. La conversación que estaba planteada como una conversación a dos, yo quiero adelantar que yo no voy a perder el tiempo robándoselo a Bill Keller, expresaré mis puntos de vista, pero lo vamos a fabricar así, como una conversación, más bien una entrevista. He tenido la oportunidad de hablar con un hombre que es un premio Pulitzer, experiencia extraordinaria en momentos delicadísimos de la historia que hemos vivido también aquí con pasión, incluso la guerra de Irak y posteriormente los casos de Wikileaks, etcétera, y creo que todos van a agradecer que esta conversación sea más bien una oportunidad de conocer las experiencias y los puntos de vista de Bill Keller. Y en relación con lo que preguntaba Iñaki, yo tengo siempre la impresión de que estamos en el centro de un terremoto. Y, por tanto, en el centro de un terremoto es muy difícil hacer vaticinios. Como bien decía Bill Keller, las combinaciones de cosas irán viéndose en el futuro. Por el momento es difícil saber. La existencia de conceptos que están muertos y vivos a la vez, ahí lo decíamos con Inarity, es la realidad en la que vivimos. Estamos asistiendo a un cambio de tal naturaleza que es muy difícil en este momento pronosticar nada. Como digo, vivimos con herramientas que sabemos que ya no van a valer y sin haber aprendido del todo herramientas que ya sabemos que van a valer, aunque sabemos que van a durar muy poco porque pronto serán sustituidas por otras, y estamos llenos de preguntas y tenemos muy pocas respuestas. Yo lo único que creo es que la evidencia de este cambio es clarísima, percibida por todos y cada uno de los ciudadanos del mundo, y en ella nos encontramos. Reflexionaremos, por tanto, en el medio del terremoto y haremos profecías y vaticinios que estarán condenadas a ser muy relativas, habida cuenta de las circunstancias. Yo reitero que es para mí un honor estar aquí, un honor estar con Bill Keller, y que espero que esta tarde, deseándole lo mejor al Atleti, por supuesto, tengamos la oportunidad de reunirnos bastantes para escuchar lo que Keller nos puede decir.
¿Más preguntas, por favor? Sí, hay una pregunta ahí.
Hi. As I'm a freelance writer, I will have now the opportunity to have a conversation face-to-face with Mr. Chuck Palahniuk. So I would like to ask you about your presence here in this festival, and how do you feel like sitting on the same table with people who are very important in communication, in politics, and how do you feel like just talking about literature, that is the aspect, my profession actually. I beg your pardon because my bad English, but I'm just trying to ask you, how do you feel in this small city, Southern Europe, with all these important people? What information will you take for your next works in this kind of festivals? I mean, is it a good subtract to take funny things about human beings or something? Thank you.
Inside my head, I'm thinking, please keep talking. Please keep talking. Please keep talking. Because the moment you stop talking, I have to say something. And I have no idea what to say in such august company.
Maybe my question was not so direct. I'm not used to this kind of thing, so sorry.
Keep talking.
No, I'm very flattered and honored to be here. And I'm always fascinated about meeting people. If I may, I'm about to ruin your evening. A few weeks ago, I was at a very elegant dinner party, a charity banquet, full of very wealthy, powerful people. And I was sitting with an oncologist, a cancer specialist, and he was telling a very funny story about having been on the airplane going there. He was having a glass of wine, and there was a very talkative, friendly woman next to him. And as he drank his wine, she was saying that she loved wine. She would love to have a glass of wine. She'd been drinking wine her entire life. It was one of her greatest pleasures. But the last time she'd had a glass of wine, she'd felt a small burning in the base of her throat, a stabbing pain. And she decided that that meant that God was telling her not to drink wine anymore. So God did not want her to drink wine, but she still loved wine. And the oncologist who's telling me this story, he turned to her on this very crowded flight, and he said, "Ma'am, that wasn't God. That's what they call a canary indicator. And anytime you drink alcohol, wine, beer, liquor, if you feel a stabbing, burning pain in the base of your throat, that means you have stage 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma, and you will probably die within 3 months. You need to talk to your general practitioner, have him call me, and you need to start making funeral arrangements. And he said that she was a lot less chatty after that. And so I find now, anytime, tonight, when you pick up that glass of wine, your first thought is going to be, will it burn? And when it doesn't burn, you're going to feel so good. And so really, no matter how intimidating the company might be, I find that there's always someone that tells me something fascinating that changes the rest of my life, for good and for bad. And so I'm not really excited about what I will contribute today. I'm much more excited about what I'll learn from people. So that's how I approach it. Enjoy that wine.
Sí, yo quería preguntarle. ¿Hola?
Sí, sí, funciona.
No me oigo yo. Quería preguntarle al señor Verdon por si considera que la novela negra como género debe cumplir también algún tipo de papel a la hora de desenmascarar secretos o mentiras de determinados poderes, tal y como reza el estereotipo en función.
I think black novel meaning, I suppose, crime stories. Roman noir, I think it's a translation from French.
If I understand the question, it's should dark novels deal with the kind of subject matter that we're talking about here today? Yes. As well, you see, I think my own approach to this whole issue of secrets and lies has to do with, at a very personal basis. I mean, some of the people who I think are involved in this conference are talking about the issue from a very broad macro social point of view. And for me, I think particularly in terms of the kind of writing I do, it comes down to an extremely personal thing. I think that, deception is not, just a subject off to the side of human nature. I think that secrets and lies are at the very heart of who and what we are. I think evolution has given us 3 great tools for survival, sharp teeth, fast feet, and the ability to lie. And I think that it's a very natural thing for human beings. I mean, 2-year-olds are very good at it already, and I think the notion that it's in a sense the notion that it's a problem we can solve is not exactly true. I think there's a way of, particularly maybe for fiction writers, for dark novelists, if you want, or any novelist, to approach the issue. I think that secrets, lies, the lies we tell, if we're willing to be honest about looking at ourselves, about asking myself, what kind of lies do I really tell? And maybe more importantly, what kind of lies do I like to believe? Because lying is only effective in the world because many of us like to believe lies. And I think if I'm willing to look at what lies do I believe and what lies do I tell, and use that as in a way as a window into my own soul, I think maybe then I start to discover, the ultimate mystery. I think mystery stories are very interesting, and I think they're very attractive to a lot of people. And I think the reason is that ultimately mystery stories are metaphors for discovering who we are. When I discover the nature of my own deceptions,
I think I discover who I am. And that's the general subject that, I think on Friday night that Paul and I are going to be talking about. It's not just the dark side of deception, but it's what can I learn from it and what can I learn about myself. I hope that's responsive to your question.
So it's not just self-deception, but also self-knowledge. At least 3 more good questions.
Quería hacerle una pregunta a Chuck Palahniuk. La última novela que está traducida en español, que es Tell All, es Al desnudo, no condenada, que era la que tú decías que todavía no se traduce, o estamos esperando. Yo he leído todavía sin traducir Condenada, Damn, y quería preguntarte ¿cuál es tu próximo proyecto? O sea, ¿en qué estás trabajando ahora? ¿Estás realizando, cuál es tu novela próxima? ¿Qué estás haciendo? ¿En qué estás trabajando? Which is your next project? Or if you can explain something about which is your interest in general. What do you have in your brain now, as we say in Spanish?
In 1999, when the Fight Club movie was launching, my father was shot and killed by a kind of deranged man. And in 2008, when the movie Choke was being launched, which was about a son trying to save his mother who was in the hospital, my mother was diagnosed with lung cancer, and I spent most of that year in the hospital with her. And so the coincidence of my father being shot at the same time that we had a movie about a man being shot to death, and then my mother dying in a hospital bed at the same time we had a movie launching about a mother dying fairly young in a hospital bed, it was just too much to be with. So I wanted to write 3 books about my parents' deaths, but 3 books by a 50-year-old man about his parents' death was just not going to be very much fun for you or for me. So I thought, why not reverse it? Make it about a small girl, originally a 9-year-old girl, who was inexplicably dead, and she was cast into hell, and that she was going to, in a way, mourn her parents, but they would still be alive. So by inverting the situation, I was able to turn it into a comedy kind of based on, in part, Gulliver's Travels, which includes 3 islands, and is travel writing, and Dante's Inferno, which is 3 locations, travel writing, and Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, which is more or less 3 places, travel writing. So in a way, it's this hybrid of travel writing, which is basically me mourning my parents' death over 3 books, and completely rips off Judy Blume. So, yeah, the first one was called Damned. The second one is almost done, and eventually this little girl will no longer miss her parents.
Sí, buenos días. Una pregunta tanto para Iñaki Gabilondo como para Bill Keller. En su carrera profesional se han enfrentado muchas veces a secretos y a mentiras. Si nos pueden contar cuál fue la mentira o a la más grande o la más que más les afectó en su carrera profesional o ante su carrera, y si nos pueden desvelar algún secreto que en su día fue secreto y que ahora ha dejado de ser y que se nos pueden contar en el tema profesional.
First, Bill.
No, you first.
I try to remember this. no sé, vamos a ver. Eran mentira las armas de destrucción masiva, que fue una mentira que nos contaron y que lo descubrimos que era mentira. Eran mentira los terroristas suicidas del 11M, mentira que yo difundí porque me hicieron partícipe no a mí, vamos, al equipo nuestro, y luego se descubrió que era mentira. Como para señalar dos gordas famosas, una provocada por otros y otra indirectamente producida a través del programa que yo hacía. Secretos, no lo sabría en este momento recordar. Lo que sí creo es que en el momento actual, además de los secretos y de las mentiras, hay otro elemento que hace cada vez más difícil el encuentro con la verdad, y es la complejidad. La complejidad de la telaraña social y del mundo en el que vivimos hace que la verdad se escape y se aleje, convirtiéndose en cada vez más inasequible, y no porque haya siempre voluntad de secreto, aunque muchos se beneficien de eso, ni porque alguien nos quiera mentir, aunque muchas veces también eso, sino por la propia telaraña de una complejidad creciente que hace cada vez más difícil el buceo de la verdad. Necesitaría un poquito más de tiempo. Sabéis que a cierta edad las cosas que obligan a recordar tienen un poquito de mal uva.
Well, I think I have to agree with Iñaki that the most consequential lie that I've dealt with in journalism was the lie about weapons of mass destruction. It's an interesting discussion to what extent that was a lie that the government told us and to what extent it was a lie that the government told itself. That is, to what extent Dick Cheney and George Bush and Donald Rumsfeld actually believed, because they wanted to believe and needed to believe, that Saddam Hussein represented a kind of existential threat to America. But in any case, it was a falsehood, and it was one that I believed at the time. I've written recently at some probably tedious length, examining my conscience on that decision, and you can look it up online. Secrets. I'm not going to divulge any of my own. I do a pretty good job of keeping them secret from myself. Probably the most consequential secret that I've dealt with as a journalist was surprisingly not WikiLeaks, although that was had a lot of resonance in the world and at the New York Times. It was in 2005 when we published the fact that the United States agencies were eavesdropping on Americans, apparently in violation of the law, as part of their global war on terror. I'm sure there are more important secrets that have been revealed by others, but in terms of stories that were written exposing what the government was up to on my watch, that's the one that sticks in my mind, in part because we were so fiercely attacked by our own government for doing it, and in part because the only time I've ever been invited to the Oval Office was when we were about to publish that story, and George W. Bush, the president, invited me and our publisher and our Washington bureau chief in to try to lecture us on his belief that if we published this information, we would bring harm to the United States. That's something that sticks with you. I think we were right to publish that information, and I'm glad we did. But of the many secret bits of information that have been published while I've been at the New York Times, that's the one that I'll probably remember longest.
Hola. Al hilo de la complejidad de la que hablaba Iñaki Gabilondo, yo les quería preguntar a él y a Bill Keller en torno al ejercicio de la profesión de periodista, que, por ejemplo, en este mismo momento tiene que lidiar con esos agentes externos que en un momento dado pues pueden querer manipular la información, puede haber presiones de instituciones, de poderes fácticos, de poderes económicos, y luego regresa a la redacción y se encuentra con una línea editorial bastante definida, que también conforma una forma de presión sobre el trabajo, una forma de evaluar qué es lo que va a ser grande, qué es lo que va a ir a portada, qué es lo que no, qué es lo que ni siquiera va a salir, ¿no? Y bueno, incluso de evaluaciones dentro de los cargos o el miedo al paro. El ejercicio de la profesión de periodista creo que es bastante heroica, especialmente ahora que se paga muy mal, y me encantaría que cualquiera de los dos o los dos me dieran su opinión sobre esto que expongo, arrojaran alguna luz si la hay, y ojalá me den la alegría de decirme que ellos no lo han vivido o que creen que no pasa en todos los medios de comunicación. Gracias.
Perdón, yo quisiera que fuera Bill Keller quien respondiera en este sentido. La mezcla de acción de los periodistas y de línea editorial, que la pregunta da por evidente, no es así en el New York Times, donde el mundo de la redacción y el mundo de los editoriales está totalmente separado. Esta es una cosa no demasiado conocida aquí en España, que yo creo que Bill Keller debería explicar, porque aunque no responde a todas las preguntas que iban incluidas en la pregunta, sí, en cierto sentido, sitúa de una manera bastante certera no el problema del paro y del trabajo, pero sí el problema de la posibilidad de actuar con honestidad informativa sin que el peso de la línea editorial esté actuando como una máquina que se cruza permanentemente. Yo creo que la mecánica de articulación de la redacción y del equipo de editoriales en un periódico como New York Times, que es diferente a lo que suele darse en España, creo que nos puede iluminar bastante. Bill.
I'm certainly not going to try and comment on Spanish journalism or European journalism, but it is true that in the American journalistic culture, there is a tradition and a protocol of separating, not just separating the opinion section from the news section, which we do, but also separating the news section from the business section. So I sometimes tell people in America that American journalism is the only business I know of where the people who make the product don't talk to the people who sell the product. And the reason we do is because we don't want some major advertiser trying to use to manipulate the newspaper. That said, of course, we are always the target of attempts to manipulate us. The spin doctors, the public relations machine, people lie to us. You'll be not surprised to learn. Governments lie to us. Companies lie to us about their business. We have a couple of things that serve as protection against being manipulated. One of them is we have a First Amendment that is a very valuable shelter against especially official intimidation. But the most important thing, and it's very hard to explain if you haven't lived in it, is the culture of independence that exists within a serious news organization in the United States. To publish a story that was based on misleading spin or lies from a corporation or a government would be regarded by your colleagues and peers as a shameful act and something that the institution would promptly seek to correct in public and apologize for. We have a culture of independence and a culture of correction that it doesn't make us perfect. We still publish mistakes, and because we publish a lot of corrections, you know that we make a lot of mistakes. But I think it's that culture of sort of self-awareness and self-examination, even more than the legal protections and the separation of opinion and journalism, that goes a long way towards keeping us as honest as we can be.
de prensa y que disfrutéis mucho del festival. Gracias. De parte del alcalde, que tenía un acto a las 12 y que se ha tenido que marchar corriendo. Gracias.
Hard to talk about this stuff without seeming like a sanctimonious gas bag.
In the middle of the day.
But I love the story about the oncologist on the airplane.
Personal